Hi there. Good afternoon. We're going to get started in a minute or so. Welcome. Thanks for being here today for the Carson Scholar Lightning Talks, Resilience in the 21st Century. This is part 3, and the theme this afternoon is heat. Can you help me advance the slide, if you don't mind? Oh, thanks. Perfect. The Carson Scholar Program is a science communication program committed to training the next generation of environmental researchers in the art of science communication. It's named in honor of Rachel Carson, who's the mother of the modern environmental movement and considered to be one of our country's most extraordinary science communicators. With the program, we aim to build a network of graduate students devoted to furthering their capacity to communicate their work to decision makers in the public through writing, media, and outreach. I'm Andrea Gerlach, a faculty member here in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment, and director of the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy. It's a real honor to share the mentoring work of this program with my colleagues, Kevin Bonine and Chris Kokinas, and we incredibly benefit from the administrative work of AIR, especially of Ariane and of her team this evening here with her Amanda and DJ. They feed us, organize us, provide the music, the raffle, the space, the tech. We're really grateful for all of the support that you provide. We're now in our 10th year of the Carson Scholar Program here at the university. We have worked with more than 100 scholars across 25 disciplines. We've raised and awarded more than $500,000 in fellowship. And this slide just is a quick little snapshot that shows the broad support that we receive across the university and from private donors. Perfect. This is how it's going to work this evening. We have 4 Carson scholars working on the issue of heat. They're going to present their work in this lightning talk session. The talks are about 7 minutes each, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end after all of their presentations. I just want to pause for a moment and give a big round of applause for all of the Carson scholars that are part of this cohort who've been presenting this week. So please join me. Okay, I want to invite Susan up to give us a little introduction to the whole series on heat.
Thank you all so much for being here this evening. We're really excited to share our work with you. So the theme, as we know tonight, is heat. As our Earth undergoes climate change, heat is a really big factor that a lot of us are looking at with our research. So we're going to take a really broad scale look at how heat impacts ecosystems and move down to a community scale, an individual scale, and then how humans are impacted by the heat that our planet is facing. So with that, Julie, will you start us off?
Awesome, thanks. Thanks for that introduction, Susan. And thank you all for being here, whether it's in person or on Zoom. My name is Julie Edwards, and I'm a PhD student in the School of Geography, Development, and the Environment, and also associated with the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research. I am also a time traveling detective. I solve mysteries about past climate. I'm a tree ring scientist, and I use tree rings to study the climate of the past. So this graph here is showing past temperatures over the like a pretty broad time scale, right? Millions of years. And it's showing these temperature changes relative to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And also in relationship to our potential future temperatures as well with different emissions. So understanding past climate is important because what's past is prologue. It understands our understanding of the climate system in general and how the climate will behave in the future. Places like the North American tree line in particular, this is the northernmost limit, this is the northernmost limit that trees can grow at. This is where the vast forests meet the tundra, and these are areas that are facing climate change most rapidly. They're rapidly warming now, and they're going to continually rapidly change in the future. But how this place changed in the past is still a mystery. So the North American tree line is also a really great place to look at evidence of the effect of major volcanic eruptions in the climate system. So this red line is showing temperature over time over a 60-year period, this upward trend that we know really well. Each of these callouts is a major volcanic eruption, and you'll notice that it's associated with decreases in temperature or time of global cooling. So major volcanic eruptions are a major player in the climate system. Thanks. Yeah, I could hear that myself. Thank you. So when we want to understand climate, we usually look to climate models, weather stations, and rain gauges. But if we want to look at climate of the time before these instrumental measurements, we have to turn to something else. So we can turn to nature's weather recorders, trees. So these barkless, wind-stripped, sun-bleached remnant pieces of wood lie scattered across the North American tundra, and they have a story to tell. So tree ring scientists like myself can essentially read the record of these trees and listen to their stories and learn about past climate from them. These long dead mummy trees can tell us about past climate from nearly 2,000 years ago. So how can I exactly read the record of these trees as a tree ring scientist? So for example, tree growth at the North American tree line is limited mostly by temperature. So when we have a wide ring, each one of these bands, you see this light color and then, something like this dark color. These are individual years of growth. So a wide band like this would indicate a warm summer. The tree is really happy. It's growing really well. But then a narrow period of rings, like these ones here, would indicate continuous cold, multiple years of cold over summer. One such period of continuous cold was known as the Little Ice Age. And this time period lasted from about the 16th century to the 19th century. And so tree rings give us a window into this other world of this cold world. And this painting here was actually created in the Little Ice Age. So, we can use these two things in combination with each other, these kind of historical documents with the tree ring record. The Little Ice Age was also a time period of a lot of major volcanic eruptions. And so this is a tree ring at the microscopic scale showing the cellular structure of the rings, the trees, and we're looking here at evidence of a past volcanic eruption. So this is just pointing out these individual years so you can better see them. So 1783 was the year of a major volcanic eruption in Iceland known as the Lockheed Eruption. And you'll see for 1784, it's a really tiny ring, right? You can almost barely see it. So the tree was not happy when it was growing. And this volcanic eruption was observed across the world during this time. Written historical documents talk about an extreme heat wave and volcanic sulfurous sulfuric haze that covered most of Europe. There's also a Inupiaq story from Alaska that talks about an abnormally cold summer. So we can also see these effects in the tree ring record as well. Another time period that we know about is called the medieval climate anomaly. Unfortunately, in comparison to the Little Ice Age, we know less about this time period. So we think that this probably happened in the 9th through the 12th century. And we know less about this time period because there are a few tree ring records that extend this far back in time. So this map here is showing a collection of tree ring records that are basically good for reconstructing temperature back to 1000 CE. Each one of these dots is an individual tree ring record data source. And so other tree ring scientists have done a really great job at filling out the data in the Eastern Hemisphere. What I'm going to be doing for my work is Alaskan and Canadian tree lines. So for my detective work, I'm going up to Alaska and Canada with a handsaw like the ones these people have to collect some wood. And then also I'm going to have some bear spray, a polar bear encounter to solve the mystery of past climate. Thank you.
Is it on? Great. Okay, so Julie brought us to a large ecosystem scale looking at heat, and now I want to bring us down to a smaller scale. Specifically, I am studying aquatic insects of Sonoran Desert Tinajas. So Tinaja is an old Spanish word for bowl, and the ecosystem is this eroded depression in a rock outcrop, and it fills with water and slowly evaporates over time. So that's what we're talking about when we say tinajas or rock pools. So they come in all shapes and sizes. This is a really large rock pool, about the size of a backyard swimming pool. And they can be any size all the way down to something more akin to a bathtub or kitchen island, or even what might look just like a puddle on the landscape view, or even as small as a popcorn bowl or a big serving bowl for salad. And the larger they are, the longer they last, because it takes more time for more water to evaporate. And so the length of time that the water lasts is called the hydroperiod. So that's the number of days from the rain event that fills the pool to the day that the pool is completely dry. And so our heat component here is that the sun drives evaporation. The warmer the temperature, the faster the evaporation rate. And so that's what drives the hydroperiod, the number of days of inundation in the pool. And the hydroperiod is really important to these ecosystems because it structures what insects can live in the water. So each of these insects has a different life cycle, and the amount of time that it needs to complete that life cycle has to fit within the amount of time that the pool has water, right? Otherwise, it could die. So depending on how long the water lasts, there could be different insects that meet those conditions. And so that's the big question that I'm looking at for my research is, do pools with longer hydro periods have different insects living in them than pools that have shorter hydro periods? So there's two components there that I have to understand. I have to know what the hydro period of the pool is, and I have to know what the insects are. So to tackle that first part, this is me setting up a game camera. So this is how I monitor the hydro period. I put this small camera up and it faces the pool. And so every day I get a photo of the water level. So I can track the inundation level over time. I can see when the pool fills and when it's totally dry. So just to see what that looks like, here we are at a pool. It's July 27th. It's 150 degrees. Not really, it's probably only 115. It's just on a rock. But we can see the day that it rains. So this is July 30th. On the 31st, we can see the pool is completely full. A week later, it's only half full. 2 days after that, it can't support that algae mat anymore. It's drying down, and I won't keep showing you pictures, but by the 16th, it's completely dry. So it lasted only about 2 weeks. But no matter how short that hydro period is, there are really amazing insects that live underneath the surface and have strategies to survive when the water goes away. So this is me again. This is what my field works look like. I hike across the desert with my net there, and I hike out to those pools, check and see if they have water, and see what the insect situation is. So there I am taking a sample with my net. I bring the samples back to the lab, and there I can count the number of species that I find and the abundance of each of those species. So things I might find in my net when I take a sample in a Tinaja or Washko are things like aquatic beetles and dragonfly larvae. So these are small organisms, but they're mighty. So they can fly really far and find a new habitat when theirs is dried up. So these beetles might be less than the width of my finger, but they can fly probably at least 2 miles to another habitat. And these dragonflies, this is a really big larva, right? It doesn't have wings yet. It needs about 6 months to get this big. So it needs a long-lasting pool. But after that, it has the capacity to fly a really long distance to find new water. Another thing I might find in my net are Solderfly larvae. And they have a really cool adaptation where if the pool dries while they're still in their larval development stage, they can shut their bodies off and basically exist as a raisin in sediment, just waiting for water to come back. And then they can continue living their lives. One of my favorite things are berry shrimp, or tadpole shrimp sometimes, which have all these little filaments fluttering. They're collecting little pieces of dead leaves and things out of the water. And their adaptation for surviving is really, really cool. So they can tell as the water dries down that the mineral concentration is increasing because only the water leaves, not the minerals. And so they can sense that change with their bodies. That signals to them that they need to lay their eggs, and their eggs can stay in the pool totally dry, just waiting for rain for 100 years before they might hatch. They can last a really long time and live in pools that last a really short amount of time. You might be wondering, why does this matter? What do all these insects that I've never seen in pools that are hidden away in the desert, what do they mean to me? Well, with climate change, temperatures in the Sonoran Desert are increasing and rainfall is decreasing. So in the future, pools that used to last about 4 months might only last 1 month. If the evaporation rate is higher because temperature has increased and there's less water to begin with, they might not last very long. And that means that maybe all of the insects that used to live in that pool, they might not be able to live there anymore. So things like dragonflies that take a really long time to beetles that have to lay their eggs and let their larvae grow. We might just have species that are very tolerant to drought at the end. And it's really important to understand what these changes are going to be, because these insects are all part of a giant food web. They support lots of things that live above them. They contribute to the way the ecosystem functions, like breaking down dead plants and recycling nutrients. And so they're very important to the way everything works. We want to make sure that if we can protect them. So the more that we know about these tools and their communities of influence, the more we can do to conserve that aquatic biodiversity in the desert. Thank you all so much.
We're going to take a quick moment to figure out the audio, so just be patient, and thank you. We will be right back with you. Hello? Okay, we could turn it up a little. Hello? Okay. I think now I know that this is what I need to change, and I can stand up here while Austin is going. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's just like if there's loose cable, so many cables, so many. But at the first Okay, thank you for your patience. We will now continue with our regularly scheduled programming.
Alrighty, let's get started. So we just heard about from Susan how these species and organisms are adapting and responding to heat at a community level, and I want us to kind of zoom in a little bit and think about one individual species in a particular community for the next 10 minutes or so. So I'm going to be talking about our protagonist here today. The White-Lined Sphinx Moth. So we're going to be talking about how these moths are responding to heat both locally and kind of across their range. So let's jump in. So right now, this is hopefully going on in our backyards, in the foothills, where we live, where we recreate, where we have fun, where we maybe enjoy getting outside and picnicking. But this is springtime in the Sonoran Desert, right? We have these beautiful flowers. We have kind of this canopy, so to speak, depending on your perspective, of life and color taking off. But this is only one side of kind of the ecological equation, right? On the other side, we have this whole range of and community of pollinators. Also local, and some of which are native here to the Sonoran Desert. So kind of starting up here, we have some moths, we have bees and butterflies, bats. We have, I'm going to switch over here, we have a carpenter bee. Here's our protagonist again, the hawk moth, and butterflies. So hopefully we've seen some of these. They're out and about. I actually just saw some over here in the courtyard, hummingbird flying around. And, they have intrinsic worth on their own, but kind of more selfishly, we can thank pollinators since kind of 1 in 3 bites of our food is thanks to them. So kind of on a human scale, at least I'm certainly appreciative of the work they do, going around pollinating plants, providing seeds, fruits, etc. So let's focus again, like I said, on our sphinx moth, which is a native here to the Sonoran Desert. So what I'm showing you is a map of its geographic range across the US, across Northern America, or North America. And these blue dots are representations of where they've been found within this range. And so we can see here in Southern Arizona, there's a great thriving population, just kind of one dot there, but they're all over. And these are generalist moths, meaning that they're kind of jack of all trades. They're going to visit any flower you throw at it, and hopefully will do a good job and pollinate the plants. They are very charismatic. They fly at dusk. They're often mistaken for hummingbirds because they're just so agile and large and beautiful. So they're geographically kind of extensive. Also dip down into Mexico and Central America. But, going on in the background of all this is this warming, right? And so again, here's a map of the United States, and I want to direct your attention to this axis here. And this is the warming that's happened in the past 30 years minus the warming that's happened in the past 100 years. And so the warming that's happened kind of in the past, on average, across these locations, has swamped out, in many cases, indicated by this dark red, this other mean temperatures, right? And so again, focusing on kind of our little niche, our little home in the Sonoran Desert, we can see that temperature has gone up significantly over the past, for sure, 30 years, but much longer than that. So in the background, these generalist pollinators are contending with warming at a large scale, and how might they respond? So, but before I tell you that, let's take a little quick deep dive into moth and butterfly biology. Now, and I want to do that by showing you the developmental kind of framework of these moths, starting with these little larvae. So there's generally 5 stages of development. They grow and they grow and they grow and they eat, and then they finally pupate when they get to a specific size and, you know, have eaten enough. They stay in this little as little pupae for a while, and then they emerge as adults. And another really kind of important part of their biology is what they're feeding on during this developmental growth. So as juveniles, as larvae, they're feeding mostly necessarily on plants. They're herbivores. They are munching away, growing exponentially. And then finally, when they're adults, they're obligate pollinators if they pollinate at all. Some don't actually pollinate, but they're feeding on the nectar provided by these plants. And so how this might play into how they're responding to heat can be one way to look at this question. So previous research has only looked at what has happened in the juvenile stage. So usually there's warming that's been done or documented in the field or experimentally, and they've kind of only looked at what's happened here. Whereas other research has kind of looked at what's happened, again, experimentally in the field or in the lab, what's happened in the adult stage. And that's, for me, this open question of, well, what happens across all of development? What happens across when warming happens here? Does that carry over, if at all, to the adult stage? And so this is what I'm thinking about, and this is where my research kind of plugs in and asks how these pollinators are affected by warming across their development. So I have two research questions. And the first is, how will heat stress across development affect their growth and survival, not just of the juveniles, but of these adults? And then 2, how will this heat stress affect rates of how much they're consuming, right, as juveniles and as adults, or how much they're pollinating? So how will it affect their interactions with these plants? And so to do this, I'm kind of doing this trifecta of ecological methods, right? I am using field experiments. There's a motley group there looking and collecting plants and moth pollinated flowers. There's this lab component that I'll be working out. This is a flight mill, so we can kind of tether up these moths or butterflies to these flight mills and see how far they fly depending on the question or the treatment that we've worked with them on. And then I'm also using simulations to forecast how some of these populations might respond over larger timescales. And so altogether, this gives us a really nice big picture a view with lots of details of how pollinators, in this case moths or butterflies or moths, might be responding. And so, like Susan, right, why does this matter? Who cares? There's lots of pollinators out there. There's bees, there's lots of things going on, but who cares about this one little moth in the Sonoran Desert? Well, at a basic level, we can understand when and how heat stress is critical to this specific moth and butterfly, or this moth development. This is kind of this big unknown question. In the fields of medicine and education, we often think about the critical dose or the level of intensity, and when we see that carry over or have carryover effects. Well, this is kind of asking the same question, but for this moth and this moth system with global warming. And so this will be a first pass at uncovering this new area. And then second, we can understand how these moths or butterflies in general might respond and adapt and move to more favorable habitats, if they move at all, right? What's allowing them to do that? And then finally, understand how both partners in this case, not just the insect, but the plant, are responding to heat stress. And this is kind of getting at and building towards these interactions piecemeal. So again, I want to leave off with this map of warming, significant warming and disparate warming across the United States. And we can think about now with this one specific and more detailed understanding of this one pollinator, we can connect it back out to the community level of other pollinators and zoom back out to see how this whole network, this whole kind of cascade might happen if we were to tinker with one or the other, and helps us build this understanding of pollinators more broadly. So with that, I want to give a big thanks and thank you.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Spencer Yeager. I'm a second year PhD student in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. And so today we've heard about how heat is affecting the ecosystem, the environment, how it's affecting a kind of a group of organisms, and then how it's affecting kind of one organism in particular. But where does that leave us, human society? And so I'm hoping that I can connect back to this with that theme of heat in a more kind of positive way, how we might be able to use heat to our advantage, how we might be able to take or adapt to it, and maybe even mitigate some of the negative impacts that come with heating. So I'm going to do that by telling you about my research, talking about solar fuels. And this is really just using sunlight to produce energy storing molecules. To really set the scene for this, I need to tell you about how much energy we as like a global population use. Each year, we're using 33 billion barrels of oil to meet our energy consumption needs. That's enough to cover the entirety of Tucson, Arizona, at least in this red box, in an ocean of oil almost 30 feet deep every single year. So the negative environmental impacts of using fossil fuels have been pretty well documented. There's things like habitat destruction, rising sea levels, and increasingly erratic weather patterns. This makes it imperative that alternative forms of energy, such as solar, hydro, or wind power, are used globally to offset some of those damages. But equally important is energy storage solutions also need to be developed such that we can still access energy when the sun isn't out, the water isn't flowing, or the wind isn't blowing. And so that's where my kind of general topic of research comes into play. I'm particularly looking at using semiconductors to make solar fuels. And it's okay if you don't fully understand those words, I'm going to get into it. I need to first talk about what solar fuels are, and then what semiconductors are. And then by doing that, I'm going to bridge the two together and hopefully give this bigger understanding. So every day we are bombarded with a crazy amount of energy. Sunlight is just a form of energy, and we all kind of know this. If we've stood outside for too long without sunscreen, we get sunburn. It's because the sunlight's literally cooking our skin. So how can we take some of this energy that's constantly being thrown at us? Well, I already talked about solar panels a little bit, but they have the one big drawback of if it's cloudy or it's nighttime, they're producing either very little or no energy whatsoever. So we need to find a way to maybe store that energy. And we can kind of take inspiration from nature here. Can anybody think of a solar-driven organism that is able to grow without constant sunlight? Anyone? No? Well, okay, I hope you're all thinking of plants. Plants can take minerals and water from the soil, turn them into sugars, and then use that to grow using photosynthesis. So they don't need a constant source of sunlight to grow because they're making these sugars. Following that line of logic, if we have maybe the appropriate starting materials, a mechanism to form some kind of energy storing material, we should have access to energy even if the sun's not out. And that's exactly what solar fuels are. They're just energy storing molecules formed via sunlight. The most commonly kind of studied is hydrogen gas that's formed as a result of splitting water. So you have water, and if you put in an appropriate amount of energy, it's going to split apart into its constituents, hydrogen and oxygen. Now, we don't really care too much about oxygen, but hydrogen is an incredibly energy dense molecule. That's just a very scientific and less threatening way of saying it's explosive. So we have water, again, we need to put energy in, but we also need some surface for that water to pretty much mosey on up to, interact, get that energy, and then split. And you can use a semiconductor for that. And that's what I'm going to tell you now about what semiconductors are, how they really function. So we have conductors that freely allow the flow of electricity, and we have insulators that don't allow any electricity to flow. As the name semiconductor might imply, it's going to fall somewhere within the middle of these two extremes, where it requires a certain level of energy, certain level of push to get that electricity flowing. Now remember, sunlight is a form of energy. And if you pair it with the right semiconductor, it's going to be able to provide that right level of push to get the electricity flowing. And again, it's a surface that you could do then chemical reactions at. And that's where my research starts to kind of come into focus. I'm looking at using semiconductors to drive this water splitting reaction. Now, some of us might have heard of semiconductors before. We might have this picture of like computer chips and phones and stuff in our head. And that's totally that's correct. Inside of all these kind of plastic casings is a semiconductor. In this case, they're usually like a really pure rock that's acting as the semiconductor. But the semiconductors that I use are organic. And in chemistry, that just means carbon-based. Now you can see just from this picture alone, there's a couple differences between these two. This one is, in a vial. This one's just a rock. And so that's one of the big advantages of what I'm looking at. You can dissolve these organic semiconductors in a solution the same way you would like Kool-Aid in water. You can't do that with a rock. Now I'm really hinting at the big consequence of this is that because you can dissolve them like this, you can turn them into an ink and print them using high-speed printing techniques. Now, I'm not talking like the printing that you do in your home office. I'm talking like full-on mass-scale printing, stuff that you'd see in like the newspaper industry. And this kind of stuff is happening right now. Here's just a picture of an organic semiconductor that's being printed kind of at a rapid scale, the same way you would, like this newspaper. And this is great because just the sheer production volume of this means you can start driving costs down in producing this material, but also start deploying it all throughout the world, even in places that might not have access to like mining equipment to go mine some of those rocks that you need for other types of semiconductors. And so remember, this is, again, great because we need a surface to drive this chemical reaction, and we're mass producing it or trying to mass produce it. And so that's the big kind of concept goal of my research. But as a chemist, I'm always working at the fundamental level. I'm taking small chips away at the sculpture to kind of realize the full picture. And so the way that I do that is through studying a particular organic semiconductor under a variety of controlled conditions. So instead of using the sunlight, I'm using a power supply. That's because I can manually add the energy that I need to study a semiconductor. And instead of using water, I'm using what is essentially laboratory Gatorade with a reaction probe, because then I can see what reactions are kind of occurring at the surface of that semiconductor. This kind of looks like Gatorade, but you really wouldn't want to drink it. I also use really small scales. I have this cell that I use in my research a lot. This is maybe 2 inches by 2 inches. And that's because if I'm using small samples, I can make a lot of them and do a lot of different little studies on them. And then here's just a picture of me working in a controlled environment. And this is all to say that I'm doing this so that I can fully understand the semiconductor that I'm working with. I want to figure out what's making it tick. And by doing that, I'm going to, again, be pushing that technology, pushing this kind of idea, just small steps forward in kind of optimizing the whole process. And with that, we can kind of begin implementing this stuff, finding ways to make it more efficient, finding ways to make the hydrogen production better, and kind of switch to that as maybe an energy source. And this gets into then draining that ocean of oil that I was talking about earlier, and giving our society, pushing our society towards a more sustainable and more green energy solution. With that, I'd like to say thank you, everyone, for listening, and thank you to the mentors and my colleagues and everyone. Thank you.
Thank you for an energy dense set of talks. That was wonderful. We have some time for questions. I know we had a little tech delay, but we have time for questions before we go back outside for some more refreshments and raffle tickets. I hope you got your raffle tickets. So any questions for the group as a whole? Individual speakers? I'll wait for you to process the semiconducting process of developing the question through. Was there a question in the back? Yeah, okay. Oh, and let's, will you get the mic? Yeah, sorry.
My question is on the Tinajas. Where in the Sonoran Desert are they found?
Yeah, great question. You can find Tinajas pretty much anywhere where there's the right kind of rock that it will erode into a pool. So if you go out to Saguaro National Park and you hike in the foothills, there's a place called Wild Horse Canyon. There are some there. I work mostly in Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument, and the rocks on the mountains there erode into these pools. They're on the top of Mount Lemmon. So there are hidden pockets of water all over the Sonoran Desert.
So my question is for, I think your name was Austin, about the hawk moths. So the warming effects on hawk moth development and their pollination is super cool, but in thinking about that broader community of desert pollinators and plants that you showed us, I'm wondering if there's any evidence for phenological mismatches between any of those pairs, or if you see heat stress as the primary concern for all of them.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think what you're hinting at and what I didn't present in this presentation and these results is this underlying kind of mechanism, this underlying process that tethers all of these pollinators together. And that's their kind of organismal response to temperature, and that unites all of them. And when you kind of take a step out and you can see how these organisms respond to temperature, in this case, this pollinator, this moth, relative to a plant, let's say a penstemon, right? This really nice, beautiful bell-shaped pink flower that's out right now. If those two kind of, their responses to temperature don't match in time, let's say it's warming earlier, then they're for sure not going to overlap. Pollination won't happen, seed set won't happen, or will be reduced, and the populations might fluctuate. That is happening. Mismatches is widespread all over the US. Sometimes they move together, plants and pollinators. Sometimes they, in either direction, forward or back. Sometimes they don't match at all. And so that is one thing that's happening in the background. And I think my research gets at that question by understanding some of the kind of more mechanistic level of how these organisms are first responding to that heat, specifically looking at how that early stress might carry over or not. And then we can make these statements about, or predictions about if that mismatch will happen. But yeah, that's a great point.
So thank you very much for your very interesting talks and also for sharing your insights with us. I have a question for Susan, I think. Well, yeah. So you told us that the temperatures will go up and the rain will go down. And does that mean that the total amount of rain during 1 year is also going down, or is it more seasonal change in the rain?
That's a really difficult question to answer. So I don't know how to model climate. What I can tell you that we are seeing for sure is that in the winter we get rain, and then it's a long dry season through the spring and the summer until the end of the summer when the monsoon rains come. And that period between spring and summer is getting drier. So things are staying drier for a longer time. And then because the temperatures are so hot, the monsoon rains, they just come down in a column, and they might only fill the pool a little bit. And then with that higher heat, it can cause evaporation to happen more quickly. So instead of that pool filling with one rain event and staying filled, it might dry and then wait for rain again in a couple weeks with a new monsoon. Understanding the total amount of rain and how it might change over the year is a question for a climatologist, and it's highly contested at this time. But generally, we expect things to be dry.
Highly contested, energy dense, it's there.
Yes.
So if I may have a question for Spencer, it's maybe a two-part question, and hopefully it makes sense, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about sort of efficiencies of these semiconductors that the ones that are, you showed, we're printing some, and then, the improvements that you're hoping to make, like, is there a percentage increase in efficiency that you're looking for, what, sort of what the marker is, and then, and is the long game, in a sense, maybe I heard the implication that the long game is this will help us transition to a hydrogen economy, or at least in part to a hydrogen economy?
Yeah, so that's those are both good questions. Right now, the whole efficiency part, that's going to be dependent on which semiconductor you choose. So like, because the ones that I'm working with are these like long chain molecules, you can, synthetically make little modifications to them, and that's going to change their properties. And so how they're working with how they interact with water, that's going to then determine the overall efficiency. And so at least right now, I think it's somewhere between maybe like, it might be like single digit percentages of like efficiency, which that is a metric that they are trying to, bump up, because if you try to get more bang for your buck when you can, and that's where they're trying to kind of push towards. And so in terms of like an actual marker, I'm sure there's one that exists of like, I guess it'd be whatever you would be able to like commercialize the material. So whichever one would take the least amount of input money to like buy, manufacture, and then would give you the biggest output. The second part of your question, what was the second question again?
Is this,
hydrogen economy.
Is this part of, at least in your thinking, like, or in this field of organic semiconductors, is the hydrogen economy sort of the long game, as it were?
So at least in that aspect, so hydrogen is just one type of solar fuel that you can make. You can use carbon dioxide as well. You can use, I think, like ammonia or something. You can use a couple different, starting materials and turn them into solar type fuels. The hydrogen economy part, there's like, that's it, because water's such an abundant thing on the planet. That's why there's a lot of push in that direction. And then there's also like in industry, like I think like Toyota is pushing really hard for hydrogen, because it's something that you can use in cars. Like you can go up, fill a tank up with hydrogen gas, and you're good to go. You don't need to necessarily like plug it in like an electric vehicle. But again, these are all things where I don't necessarily, in my opinion, I don't think you're ever going to get to one type of fuel as the full economy. I think it'll be a contribution of like a bunch, but I think hydrogen does have maybe it stands to maybe be a large kind of component of that, I guess, economy.
Thank you, Spencer. Great. Other questions over here? Okay.
Hi, I think my question's for Julie. So I really liked your tree ring talk, and I was just wondering if there are any trees that exist that their growth patterns like don't depend on any kind of climate, and like how you might date those, or if there are other methods you can use.
Yeah, thank you for your question. That's great. To answer it briefly, yes. That's actually kind of a project I'm working on now, which is a lot of fun, is I'm trying to like disentangle the different climate signals that are in bristle cones that I'm working with. So I'm seeing like a mix of temperature and precip. And in terms of like the non-climate environmental controls, in the work that I do, like I am looking for that climate signal. So there's ways that I can essentially avoid all of those other things through like where I'm sampling. So I'm like looking for trees that are like super stressed out. The only thing that's going to be affecting their growth is climate. And then in terms of dating the trees that have not so much a climate signal, that is a little hard. It depends on what you're looking at specifically. Just because the way that we can like date these trees is through these distinctive patterns that they have. So you have to have a lot of change between when there's wide cells and when there's narrow cells. And it's helpful to be able to link that to what you know about temperature, let's say. But if you just have trees that are all growing in a stand together and you're trying to date them based off of like, I'm trying to think like an insect outbreak that like might decrease growth, you might be able to do that, but it's a little tricky. Thank you.
We'll take time for maybe one more question from the audience. Yeah, Melanie. Okay. You're sparing the scholars my question, but I'll ask them afterwards, which was the physical rigors of what they're doing. I was just struck by, you're in the lab with your arms stuck and then you're out in the field and fighting off polar bears. And anyway, yeah, just the sort of physical rigors of that it's impressive, but we can chat about that afterwards. So you get the last question.
And so my question is for the Sphinx Moth project. So do you expect greater effect on the larval stage versus the pollination? Because the pollination is a timing thing. If the plant doesn't flower, that's a very very specific issue regarding changing climates. Whereas the larval just needs the plant. If the plant is out, unless it's such a severe drought that the plant doesn't emerge at all, then that's pretty severe. But I'm just curious, which end you expect a more severe, or maybe you can't really predict at this point yet?
Yeah, so to kind of repeat, I guess, my understanding of your question, you're asking when or do I predict would I predict to see the largest impact of heat stress on the development, either kind of early or late or middle or some combination thereof? Was that your question? So there is work out there. It's very scattered across different systems, and one of which is in a butterfly system, a relative here in the Sonoran Desert with the tobacco hornworm, the Manduca sexta. So it's another big charismatic moth. It's flying around. Great pollinators, more specialized. But that work was done, and it showed that it actually showed very mixed effects. So they looked at each stage, but they stopped at pupation. They didn't look at adults, right? So they showed how if you stress them out early on when they're very tiny versus when they're kind of mid-size or late, that they have this effect at pupation and survival. So we know that. We can kind of test that and build that from the Sphinx moth and compare those results to Manduca sexta. And my big question, like you said, with pollination, if one or the other, based on whether they're eating leaves or feeding on nectar, this ties in to this idea that I'm looking at how if they could compensate for some of this stress by eating more. So that's why I'm looking at rates of herbivory and also pollination as it relates to growth. And it could very well be that early instar stress, because they're so vulnerable to temperature, they're small, and fluctuations in population and just other things happen, that when they get hit with heat stress early on, that will have the largest impact just because of mere body size differences. Body size plays a huge role in all of biology. And I think we're going to see that here again. So when we zap them kind of early on with heat, that they'll have the largest impact. But yeah, we could follow up with some other questions after if you have, but yeah, that's a good one.
Awesome. Thank you, Austin. A round of applause for tonight's scholars. Take this off. Great, really lovely evening. And I'm going to pass this over to fellow mentor Kevin Bonine, who has some things to share.
Thank you, Chris, very much. Thank you, Andrea, our lead mentor. Thank you, Ariana and staff for your work. And thank you, audience, for being here, for supporting the scholars, supporting the students on campus, and learning some pretty cool things. Who out there knew that fairy shrimp eggs lasted 100 years desiccated? No, now you've got like a dinner topic